Good morning, everybody. As I said before, I'm a huge fan of international hockey. I've worked at 7 Winter Olympics for NBC, CBS, and ABC television networks. And I've written a book called Hockey, My Door to Europe. And the theme of the book is how being involved in world hockey helped me grow as a person. That is to say, on day one when I got involved in this, all I was worried about was what was taking place on the ice, the games itself. 40 years later, the games became less and less significant, and the culture, language, politics, geography of the countries I'm visiting became more and more important. My father Neil showed me the fundamentals of the game, and together with my Uncle Tom took me to my first NHL game on February 26, 1949 at Maple Leaf Gardens, when the Toronto Maple Leafs and Chicago Blackhawks skated to a 2-2 tie. I was only 5 at the time, and I remember the goaltending duel between Turk Brodo and Sugar Jim Henry. Much earlier, my father had been schooled in hockey by Ken Randall when playing junior in nearby Georgetown. Randall, who was playing for the defending Stanley Cup champion Toronto St. Pat's at the time, would come out from Toronto as long as the Pats didn't have a game to coach the junior club. The NHL schedule was only 24 games long. He had an assistant coach who would take over on the occasions of a game conflict. Randall, who was known as the Pepper Kid, played in the very first NHL game in which the Montreal Wanderers outlasted the Toronto Arenas 10-9 in Montreal on December 19, 1917. As an altar boy at St. Joseph's Parish in Acton, I followed Father David Bauer at St. Michael's Majors religiously, pardon the pun. After he coached St. Michael's to the Memorial Cup Championship in 1960-61, Father Bauer, a Basilian priest, founded the Canadian national team. That's when my interest in international hockey really begins. On my first visit to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1974, I had no knowledge of the Russian language and was baffled by the Cyrillic letters adorning signs and stores in Moscow. When I returned to Canada, I bought a Berlitz language book and started to teach myself a few words in my spare time. Finally, in the fall of 1979, I decided to take a Russian language course and spent 2 years studying in the evening at McMaster University. Fred Sherrill's Broad Street Bullies brought Philadelphia its first Stanley Cup in 1974, largely through intimidation and physically hammering the hell out of opponents. Most Stanley Cup winning coaches would have been on the golf course or lazing on the beach after that. Yet just 2 weeks after winning the Cup, Freddie the Fog and Ron Ryan, then general manager of the WHH New England Whalers, took advantage of the opportunity to expand their horizons and learn something new about the game on a 3-week study tour to Moscow. Organizer Ed Enos of Concordia University said Al Arbour of the New York Islanders was the only one of the NHL's 15 other coaches who even bothered to call to inquire about the study tour. We studied at the Central Institute of Sport and Physical Culture and took on-ice lessons from members of the Soviet national team, including Vladimir Vikulov and Alexander Ragulin. Sherrill also lectured and told the Soviets one of the reasons the Flyers won the Cup is that he adopted the Soviet system of quick counterattacks rather than having a defenseman take the puck behind the net and set up a breakout play. By that time, Sherrill argued, the defensive team already is set up and waiting for you. The Soviets, who trained at a breakneck pace for 11 months of the year, were anxious to know how an NHL practice works. Making light of the carefree attitude of the NHL and the power of the NHL Players Association under Alan Eagleson, Shiro explained how he conducts the practice. "The first thing I do," he said, "is call all the players over to one corner of the rink where we kid each other, tell a few jokes to loosen up. Then I ask them if they'd like to do some work. If they say yes, we start." Shiro said he could not consider the Flyers true world champions until they had beaten the Soviets' best club team. His visit to Moscow was a precursor to the first Super Series between NHL and Soviet clubs, which was held in December 1975 and January 1976. Near the end of our 3-week stay, he sold one of his Philadelphia Flyers club rings and took about 10 of us out to dinner at the Prague restaurant with the proceeds. Shiro knew there are a lot of headaches associated with coaching in pro hockey. There was one problem, however, he never thought he'd have to solve when he was behind the bench of the New York Rangers Central Pro Hockey League team in Omaha, Nebraska. The Rangers signed promising young Swedish prospect Ulf Sterner, who had played in the 1960 Olympics when he was only 19. Word got around the league and many players were not fond of the idea of a player from Europe stealing one of their jobs. "I knew we'd have trouble keeping opposing players from running at him," Shiro said, "but I never dreamed it would also come down from our own players at practice." Sterner made his NHL debut with the Rangers on January 27, 1965, but lasted only 4 games before being assigned to Omaha. At the end of the season, he returned to Europe for good. At that time, Moscow, a city of about 8 million, had only 4 covered ice rinks. On the last day of the tour, we had the thrill of a lifetime when we were given a chance to suit up and play a controlled scrimmage with no body contact against the Soviet national junior team. Among the players was Valery Bragin, then only 19, who has since coached Russia to the gold medal at the 2011 World Junior Championship in Buffalo. Bob Boucher, the coach of St. Mary's in Halifax, suited up for our side, along with Trevor Fahey, who played 1 game for the Rangers in 1964-65, and Brian O'Byrne, a star defenseman at St. Mary's, who had played junior for the Peterborough Petes and Montreal Junior Canadiens. Boucher had played for the St. Michael's Majors on the same line as Frank Mahavlich. His father, Billy, scored the first goal ever at the Montreal Forum while playing for the Canadiens in November of 1924. I attributed the dour looks on the faces of Muscovites to the overcrowded streets in the huge city and having to jam their way onto subway cars at rush hour. No matter where you go in the world, the less space people have to move around, the more stressed they become. The smaller the Soviet city, the friendlier people. During my travels, I've learned that Canada is not the only country that takes immigrants. All Swedes are not blondes, and that there are a large number of Asians and Muslims living in Russia. Also in 1986, I met Igor Kuperman for the first time at Luzhniki Arena. A top-notch writer for Sovietsky Sport newspaper, he emigrated to Canada 5 years later with the help of Ken Dryden and Lawrence Martin, the latter who was Moscow correspondent for the Globe and Mail. And he was hired by the Winnipeg Jets general manager Mike Smith. Smith, who had been part of a similar study tour to Moscow in the summer of 1975, was fond of Soviet players, so much so that he drafted 2 in 1990, 4 in 1991, and 9 more in 1992, at a time when most NHL clubs were still shying away from them. So Kuperman was the perfect fit in helping new arrivals acclimatize to life in North America and in recommending draft choices for the future. It was while I was in Leningrad with the Manons in 1982 that I got a behind-the-scenes look into the lifestyle of Soviet elite league players. As I approached the sports palace to watch Moscow Dynamo practice, I was shocked to see its star player, Alexander Maltsev, who holds the all-time record for games played with the Soviet national team at 321, riding on a huge pile of hockey equipment bags in the back of an old truck. When I was introduced to Maltsev as a Canadian, he replied through an interpreter wryly, "If he's a Canadian, how come he's not drunk?" Maltsev was recalling the 1972 series when many of the Canadian fans who traveled to Moscow for the final 4 games were wandering around the streets of the city inebriated after Paul Henderson scored the winning goal in Game 8. At the 1986 World Championship in Moscow, I was interviewing former national team captain Boris Mikhailov. When the young lady helping me with the translation explained Mikhailov was excusing himself to get a good place in the lineup at the souvenir counter to buy a puck. "In Canada," I replied with a grin, "Wayne Gretzky goes right to the head of the line." When Boris returned with the puck bearing the gold lettering and logo of the 1986 World Championship, I asked him why he had to line up. "Well, Gretzky lives in Canada," the legendary winger said with his customary quick wit. "Over here, everybody's equal." As hot as the rivalry was, there were occasions when the Soviets did favors for the Czechoslovaks whom they considered their Slavic brothers. At the 1982 World Championship in Finland, the Soviets clinched the gold medal early and Canada was in line to take the silver if the Soviets defeated Czechoslovakia on the final day. It was never proved, but many observers believe the Soviets tanked the final game, which ended in a 0-0 deadlock, so that the Czechoslovakians would get a point and earn the silver medal ahead of Canada. Alan Eagleson left a blank check at the front desk of the Hesperia Hotel in Helsinki to cover the destruction by furious Canadian players who ransacked. One newspaper reported that at one point Soviet star Sergei Makarov had a clear-cut breakaway but circled back with the puck rather than driving for the net. It was the first scoreless tie at a World Championship in 34 years. The last time 2 teams failed to score against each other was in 1948 when Canada and Czechoslovakia drew 0-0 on an outdoor rink covered with snow at the Olympics in St. Moritz, Switzerland. Jimmy Doyle, an American from New York, was selected to referee the Czechoslovak-Soviet game in 1982, even though he was only 25. "I was a young official and it took me a while to catch on," he said. "At the end of the second period, it dawned on me what was going on. It became apparent the game was not being played in the normal way. I went off the ice very disappointed at what was happening. But Doyle could do nothing about it. It was his job only to referee the game and see that the players stuck to playing rules." Wayne Gretzky, in the only World Championship in which he played, said, "Whether the Soviets threw the game or not is everyone's own opinion. In my opinion, they played for the tie. In the last 10 minutes of the game, Makarov and Krutov from the KL line were on the ice just once." In the third period, fans in Helsinki's Jäähalli whistled loudly to show their disgust at the defensive game both the Czechoslovaks and Soviets were playing. After the game, Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov called any suggestion that the Soviets threw the game ridiculous. "The Czechoslovaks played very well," he said, and there was no motivation for his players. But in the House of Commons, Terry Sargent, an NDP member of Parliament from Manitoba, suggested Canada show its disgust at what had taken place through official channels. There were other times when the two countries were not so friendly. At the 1998 Olympics in Japan, President Václav Havel sent a plane from Prague to fly the gold medal winning Czech team home for a celebration in Prague's Old Town Square to be attended by about 100,000 people. 11 of the Czechs, including Hasek, were from the NHL, and their clubs were waiting for them. All of them had to call their general managers to let them know about the plans to fly to Prague first. But the Czech officials had to scramble to get enough cash to pay for refueling at Irkutsk, Russia in Siberia, before the team could leave Japan. A second refueling stop was required in Kazakhstan. Ironically, the Czechs, who had just beaten the Russians 1-0 in the gold medal game, were flying home on a Russian-built Ilyushin jet and relying on the Russians for refueling. Russia was demanding payment of $50,000 US up front before the plane even lifted off. The Czechs tried to get the money at the bank in Nagano, but they could only obtain Japanese yen. Eventually, the financial problems were ironed out through diplomatic channels, and the flight took off. When a tragic air crash claimed the lives of all the players on the Lokomotiv Yaroslavl team in September 2011, Russian officials faced the monumental task of replacing the team. Similar thing going on now to a degree in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, following the tragedy out there. KHL President Alexander Medvedev wanted the team to keep playing in the KHL immediately and suggested each of the 23 teams in the league contribute 3 players to a pool for which the replacement team would be chosen. His idea was for the contributing teams to cover the salaries of the players picked for one season. However, Lokomotiv executives said the city needed time to heal, and returning to the KHL so soon was not realistic. Lokomotiv President Yuri Yakovlev recommended the club maintain its team in the Russian Junior League while having its top team join the Russian Major League, which is one level below the KHL, by December. Some of the best players from the junior club were promoted to the Major League team. The club was then allowed to sign free agents and select young players born between 1989 and 1994 who had been playing with clubs in the KHL or Major League. Those clubs were allowed to protect 2 players. The final decision on moving to Yaroslavl was then left to the individual player selected. If he was willing to make the move, his club lost him without compensation. The rebuilt men's team finally returned to the ice in the Major League in December. The Major League is approximately the equivalent of North America's American League. Yaroslavl did not have a KHL club again until the following season, 2012-13. There were suggestions the new Lokomotiv club be given a bye into the Major League playoffs, but in the end, club executives felt this would be unfair to the rest of the teams in the league. Therefore, it was decided the team would qualify for the playoffs or not, based on its winning percentage over the rest of the season. The Patchwork Club, in fact, posted a record of 13-6-3 in the regular season and made the playoffs. The final death toll from the crash was 44. Luckily, I was 500 miles away in Moscow when the nuclear plant explosion took place in Chernobyl in April of 1987. A 500-mile radius of the explosion might ultimately suffer serious effects of radiation. I had just finished covering the World Hockey Championship in the Soviet capital when I got a call from Lawrence Martin, then Moscow correspondent for the Globe and Mail, informing him of the catastrophe. Huge news stories seemed to follow me wherever I traveled in Europe. After immersing myself in the Russian language for a week, I had just sat down to enjoy a beer and a hamburger at the British Embassy in Moscow in November of 1989, when I noticed a copy of the Daily Telegraph with huge black headlines on the next table. The Iron Curtain is swept aside. East Germany throws open all its borders, the banner shouted out. Fearful of creating a panic in the populace, authorities limit coverage of both events to about 3 inches in the bottom corner of a page, and then 3 days after the fact. It wasn't long after the Soviet Union had proved it could play with the NHL's best players in 1972 that its Ice Hockey Federation tested its youth hockey players against North American teams. The champion of the Wrigley Cup National Midget Championship Tournament, the Verdun Maple Leafs, was sent overseas in 1973-74. The Wrigley Tournament was the predecessor of today's Telus Cup. The same season, the Soviets sent the midget club of the Central Army Sports Club over for a series of exhibition games in Quebec. They went undefeated on the tour, but Toronto Maple Leafs owner Harold Ballard was so upset that he convinced the Soviet team to stay for one more game. Ballard agreed to host it at Maple Leaf Gardens, with the Soviet midgets facing a team of players made up solely of midget-age players who were playing with the Junior A Toronto Marlboros and Junior B Markham Waxers. This time, the Canadian team won 4-1 before a sellout crowd. Future NHLers John Tonelli, John Anderson, Mark Napier, and Greg Millen were on the team. Although they were playing junior, they were only 16, just like Fetisov and the other Soviet players. Ballard was satisfied he had countered any arguments that the Soviets were producing better hockey prospects in Canada. In the fall of 1982, the Burlington Cougars Bantam Club strengthened Canada's position as the world's #1 hockey nation by winning a 4-team tournament in the city of Minsk, capital city of Belarusia, one of the 15 republics in the Soviet Union. The Cougars became the first minor hockey team from Canada to win a tournament in the Soviet Union. Fewer than 500 fans were in the stands when I took in a Russian Junior League game at St. Petersburg in 2011, a far cry from the 9,000 the London Knights of the Ontario Hockey League have been averaging in recent years. This in a gigantic city of 4.5 million, but with a world of cultural activities going on every evening. The St. Petersburg Club charged no admission for games. The caliber of play appeared to be middle of the table, Tier 2 Junior A. Pucks deflected into the stands were thrown back onto the ice to save money in a league with a very tight budget. Dmitry Shikin, the St. Petersburg goalie, and teammate Georgy Berdyukov had just been rewarded for Russia's gold medal victory at the World Junior Championship in Buffalo with a new Mercedes B180. This is junior players. A new Mercedes. There are poor people in Russia, but there are also rich. They're very limited, but they can afford this. All members of the team also received monetary rewards of varying amounts from the Russian Hockey Federation based on their individual performance. Chikin's share was 700,000 rubles, about $25,000 US. In the Siberian city of Novokuznetsk, gold medalist Dmitry Orlov, now with Washington, and Maxim Kitsin were promised apartments by the mayor of the city. The Russian Junior League started in 2009-10 with 22 teams. Prior to that, there was no official junior league in Russia. It now has 33, battling for the Valery Harlamov Cup. By the year 2020, when the Junior League has a decade of operation under its belt, Russian coaches fully expect a string of gold medals. The Russian Junior League has an age limit of 21, 1 year higher than in Canada. Hockey Hall of Famer Sergei Fedorov believes the Junior League could do an even more effective job of developing talent by extending the age limit as high as 25. When Slava Fetisov won a gold medal with the Soviet Union at the first World Junior Championship in 1977, the country had no official junior league. During his term as Minister of Sport between 2005 and 2008, 300 new indoor hockey rinks were built. Now Russian junior prospects are competing in anywhere from 50 to 60 games annually. Kevin Dahlman, a diminutive but highly skilled defenseman from Niagara Falls, Ontario, who had been drafted by Los Angeles, plays for the Baris Club in the city of Astana, Kazakhstan. He became a local hero, but eventually had to transfer to another club in St. Petersburg for the 2012-13 season after his wife Stacy had her visa lifted for criticizing the government of Kazakhstan on the internet. Fetisov, considered the greatest defenseman Russia has produced, held the record for points by a defenseman with 49 in 44 games until Dahlman came along. And he set a new mark of 58 points in 53 games in 2008-09. It was a Saturday morning and the Burlington Midgets were scheduled to play the first game of the Great October Revolution Tournament in Szymperk, Czechoslovakia, near the border of Poland. In those days, the Soviet Union had 100,000 troops stationed in Czechoslovakia alone, to say nothing of their deployments in other Iron Curtain countries like Poland and Hungary. That's more than the entire Canadian forces, which had only 87,000 men and women in uniform. The morning after we arrived, I set out on my usual solo tour through town, snapping shots of stores, shoppers, churches, etc. Later, I was wandering near a military base when a uniformed officer came out of the compound and indicated I should not take photos of it. Then a small Skoda automobile pulled up and a plainclothesman with a flat-top hat got out and produced some credentials. When the mysterious man asked to see my passport, I told him I had left it at the hotel. I further explained that I had not taken any photos of the military installations and had no intention of doing so, but he still told me to come with him. It was not until I was in his car that it registered with me that I was in hands of the STB, the Czechoslovak secret police. At the police station, I handed over the films and the officer put them in a special envelope marked that they should be returned to me later. For the next 6 days, I was on pins and needles, in effect under house arrest. I was never jailed, but the STB officer visited me a couple of times for further questioning. My so-called mini-trial at the police station was held in a second-floor office where I was questioned through an interpreter and was finally cleared after promising never to go near a Soviet military base again. The day I was detained, I was wearing a bright orange and blue jacket, sporting the colors of the Burlington Lions Optimus Minor Hockey Association. I'm convinced one of the deciding factors in the decision not to prosecute or jail me was that the Czechoslovaks came to the conclusion no self-respecting spy would go out on the streets wearing an orange and blue jacket. You can imagine how happy I was when Václav Havel took over as president of the country in the early 1990s and fired all the STB agents. Shortly after that, almost all of the 100,000 Soviet soldiers packed up and headed home. In 2015, I applied to the new Czech government to view my secret police files. This was now allowed under the new government. January 6th of 2016, a letter arrived at my home saying it was possible as long as I paid $50. But I never saw my films again. And in case you want to know what a secret police file looks like, there it is. It's all written in Czech. I had it translated, but it's got the official stamps, and this became public under the new government. International officiating has come a long way. Unbelievably, some players once officiated in the same IIHF tournaments in which they were playing. At the 1949 World Championship, Francis Denis Moore of Port Colborne, Ontario, refereed a half-dozen games when Canada wasn't playing. Dave Trottier played for Canada and refereed some games during the 1928 Winter Olympics. Carl Earhart refereed in 8 of the 1936 Olympic matches when Great Britain was not involved. It was not until well into the 1950s that international hockey developed a pool of dedicated referees. As a defenseman, Earhart was known to play more than 40 minutes a game. When Great Britain won its only Olympic hockey gold medal in 1936, upsetting Canada, he was 39 and became the oldest player ever to win gold. During the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, I played What's My Line with a mystery person in the steam room of the hotel. The temperature was about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and I couldn't see 6 inches past my nose for steam when I entered the bath. On the other side of the room, I saw 2 legs which looked like they belonged to an elderly man dangling down from the cedar bench. But the face, the upper body, were completely covered by steam. "Are you working for NBC too?" I asked. "No, CBC," came the mystery voice from the fog. "Just another of the national broadcaster's many cameramen," I presumed. So I brought her to see what the mystery man's specific job was. "I'm the star of Hockey Night in Canada," he replied. And that's the truth, nothing but the truth about my chance meeting with Don Cherry, who turned 80 just a week earlier on the shores of the Black Sea, 10,000 miles away from Canada. The attitude of Canadians towards the international game has changed immensely over the last half-century. Some adjustment still is necessary, however. If you value Canadian history, you'd think the 100th anniversary of its first hockey association would be accompanied by widespread publicity. Hockey Canada did its part by holding the 100th annual meeting in exactly the same French corridor room of Ottawa's Chateau Laurier as the inaugural on December 4th of 1914. The historic hotel, which was officially opened by Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, donated use of the ornate French corridor room at the time. The local media in Ottawa, however, didn't bite. The ink-stained wretches were 20 miles away at the Canadian Tire Centre in Canada, where the Ottawa Senators were honoring Daniel Alfredson for his long and faithful service by retiring his number 11 jersey. Neither the Ottawa Citizen nor the Ottawa Sun carried a single word about the ceremonial meeting and gala the next day. Meanwhile, the Sun devoted 15 of its 24 sports pages to Alfredson's jersey retirement. Canada, too, seems to have difficulty identifying its roots. In one of its bulletins in 2002, the IIHF called Canada the country that bleeds maple syrup. Maple syrup is sweet, and poutine is to die for. Many, in fact, do, from clogged arteries after eating it. So it was indeed curious when promoters were planning a bill of fare for the World Cup of Hockey Fan Village in Toronto that would include the national dish of each participating country, that they chose a grilled cheese sandwich for Canada. But sir, the aged cheddar cheese was made right here in Canada, protested a waitress when I challenged the choice. Did Sir John A. Macdonald dip his sandwich in ketchup? I rather think he was eating his cheese with a baguette in 1867. After 4 decades of involvement in international hockey, the games have become less and less important to me, and meeting new friends from around the world now is paramount. I once asked Ulf Nilsson, former NHL star, if he had any regrets about his NHL career. Probably the amount of time I wasted playing cards in hotel rooms, he said. So I just want to point out all the benefits that are involved. Players don't realize how good they have it when they're traveling to these cities. They have a marvelous opportunity to view what's going on, and many of them spend it playing cards in hotel rooms, but I took advantage to get involved in the culture, and I'm very glad I did. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Go ahead. I wanted to ask about the junior hockey in Russia. It's been going on, you said, the league for 10 years? They've had junior?
Since 2009-10.
Okay, so nearly 10 years. You said there's a difference between how many people go, like, is it because there's the, like, go to the games? There's a lot more that go to the junior games in Canada than would go.
Here's the way it works. Here's the way it works over there, both in the junior league and the KHL. It's very hard to understand. Moscow now is about 11 million. St. Petersburg is about 5 million. Those are the 2 worst draws in the league. And you think you'd be the best draws, but the reason is there's so much competition for the entertainment dollar. The stands in smaller cities like Novosibirsk and Omsk are filled. They have no trouble filling them. Other arenas tend to seat only 7,000 to 9,000. So that's the difference.
Okay.
Yes?
Would you agree that as Canadians we're delusional to think we'll stay at the top of the pyramid? Is it becoming a numbers game? There's a lot more hockey players in Russia and other places.
The biggest threat is the United States.
And our good
The
friends
United States,
south, yeah.
There's no question the United States will eventually surpass Canada. I doubt if the other countries will, but Russia will be closing the gap rapidly. Okay? Yes?
Sounds like you've visited Eastern Europe many times.
Yes?
Were you always comfortable when you were getting stopped by the secret police? Were you always comfortable being there visiting? Are you comfortable if you go now? How long did that take? Where you were just comfortable enough with the society that you weren't looking over your shoulder or just nervous?
I only had one problem, 1983, and of all the times I was in the Soviet Union, never had a single problem. But there's some circumstances surrounding my arrest in 1983. First of all, Czechoslovakia was an occupied country. It's not their country, so that creates tension immediately. The other thing was, I believe the Soviets had shortly before that time shot down a Korean airliner. So there was, everybody was on edge. The secret police, they really didn't need to arrest me, but they weren't taking any chances with anybody. But to answer your question, no problem at all in the Soviet Union. Yes?
There's always sort of an ongoing controversy about NHL ice versus European ice, and there's thoughts about moving to a compromise of having another 9 feet wide. And I played on the European ice for several years, and I played on NHL ice, and to me, it's a completely different game. So what are your thoughts about the difference in ice surfaces and whether we should move to the larger surface?
Where did you play?
Well, I was playing old timers in Geneva.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, I much prefer the European size, but a lot of Canadians do not. What I don't like about the smaller size rink is that the players are too big and too fast now, and the game turns into a pinball game. Puck is bouncing all over the place, hitting shin pads, hitting shoulder pads. You just never, so much luck involved. The reason I like the wider ice, you can see plays developing. Now, I will say this, much harder to score a goal on wider ice because the angles are different for the shooters and the goalkeepers. But that's my own opinion, but most Canadians do not agree with me, and even some Europeans don't agree because they're downsizing their rinks in some places, but I have no idea why they're doing it. Okay?
You, Dennis?
Okay.